Chapter 22. Authority to Rule. An academic orientation can produce serious disorientation. This is why the shift of theology from the pulpit to the seminary has been disastrous for the faith. It is an easy matter for a classroom professor to talk about God, another thing for oppressed Job to cry out, "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me." Job 19:25-27. To hear a raped woman weeping say that she cannot understand why this horror has taken place, but that her faith and her consolation is in the Lord, is to come face to face with living theology. The memory of such confessions of faith humbles and shakes one. This classroom approach has done great harm to our understanding of Romans 13. As we have seen, Paul does not give us an abstract theological premise for the state. He was answering a very pressing problem for Christians. Two lords claim dominion over them, Christ and Caesar. With Christ as their Lord, what was their relationship to Caesar? Paul reduces the state and Caesar from lordship to servitude to God, to a diaconate. The state's calling and duty is to be a terror to evildoers and to be God's minister. The Christian's calling is not to revolution, but to work out the implications of regeneration and to make all things new in Christ. Too often, however, the Church has seen Romans 13 as a blank check for the state. This has been especially true of Protestants since the rise of Pietism, and at times true also of Catholics as well. Too often, the modern mind sees a stripping of freedom and power from the Church as the same as Reformation. At the time of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the princes of Europe all claimed sovereignty and were resentful of the Church's freedom and power. The evils within the Church gave them excuses for rebellion, although none of these rulers were paragons of virtue. A number of states, resentful of the papacy's power and tax gathering, both things coveted by them, were able to push Rome into granting concordats. These concordats recognized the imperial power and jurisdiction of these states within their own realm. The Church in those states went extensively under the control of the crown. Patronage, presentation, and supplication were transferred to the crown. The Church was to be a congregation of the faithful, but not an independent power. France and Spain were most notable among those gaining such powers and, in effect, ruling the Church within their domain. Wherever concordats were not obtained, the princes were favourable to the Reformation and were receptive to Lutheranism, and in England to a national church distinct from those of the continent. The Anabaptists despaired of any hope in civil government. They sought a radical separation from the world, which, while stressing a voluntary church and a quote-unquote spiritual reformation, was marked by a surrender of civil order as evil and beyond redemption. Extremists in Anabaptism sought to establish their own civil order of the saints by revolution, but most withdrew and regarded both the state and the Church, which worked within the framework of civil order, as false and even evil. To most princes and churchmen, it was the Anabaptist solution which was evil. It was imperative thus for Calvin to avoid any association of his movement with Anabaptism, with which he emphatically disagreed. As a result, Calvin strongly stressed civil obedience while allowing for ordered change through civil magistrates. The Renaissance was an era of statism, tyranny, and corruption. Revolt made sense to many and was very much in the air. For Calvinism to have fanned the fires of civil revolt would have been fatal. An analogy to the present can be made. I find, wherever I speak, churchmen, as they hear of the persecution of Christians and encroachments on religious freedoms in the United States, are quick about asking if it is not about time to resort to arms. I find it imperative to emphasize civil obedience. I stress the fact that a very, very large number of church members do not vote. Very, very few ever contribute to a political campaign, and fewer are active in politics. When the means of peaceful solutions can readily give us the victory, to talk about suicidal violence is morally wrong. We have a battle to wage peacefully in the courts and in legislative bodies. Calvin was concerned with avoiding an ungodly disaster, so too must we be concerned. Moreover, there is no merit in either an armed revolt nor in a peaceful conquest of the courts and legislatures if there is no valid doctrine of authority and civil government. The Middle Ages raised the question of legitimate authority. Too often in the modern era, churchmen have accepted the state per se as the valid authority. Much of our understanding of the concepts of earlier eras is warped by our misunderstanding of their terminology. Thus, the 12th century monk and scholar Gratian wrote, quote, "Mankind is ruled in two ways, namely by natural law and by customs. The law of nature is that contained in the law and gospels, by which each is ordered to do to another what he wishes to have done to himself, and is prohibited from inflicting on another what he does not wish done to himself. Wherefore Christ said in the Gospel, quote, 'All things whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye also to them, for this is the law and the prophets.'" End quote. Natural law to contemporary Catholic and Protestant scholars has a different meaning, and the difference is even more marked in men like Strauss. For Rufinus, 1170, quote, "Natural law, which was all but lost in the first man, has been restored in the Mosaic law, perfected in the gospel, and adorned in custom." End quote. In other words, the Bible and its law is natural law because it comes from the God whose law is in all being. Henry de Bracton, died 1268, said, quote, "Now the author of justice is God, and thus justice is in the Creator, and accordingly, use and lex mean the same." End quote. That is because justice and law are identical in God. Hence, Aquinas could hold that a tyrannical law is a perversion of law. Aegidius Romanus, 1302, made lordship or rule contingent upon grace. In Lewis's words, quote, "To Aegidius Romanus, any disposition of lordship made by earthly law was valid only if the person enjoying it was duly subordinated to God his Lord and was in receipt of his grace." End quote. By establishing authority and rule in grace and in faithfulness to God's justice, certain things followed. Infidels and excommunicates could hold property but had no valid title to it. The same applied to ungodly rulers within Christendom. Since kings and commoners paid tithes to the church, they thereby recognized the church's general lordship over all earthly goods. At first, Aegidius's doctrine greatly strengthened papal power. It made a distinction between ownership and lordship or dominion. True dominion belongs to the realm of grace, supremely to God. However, in the hands of Archbishop Richard Fitzralph, this doctrine underwent further development. Fitzralph used it to attack the Fraticelli or spiritual Franciscans. The Fraticelli attacked ownership and separated property and dominion from grace. Hence, a property church was out of grace. Wycliffe held that, quote, "No one is civil lord, no one is prelate, no one is bishop while he is in mortal sin." End quote. The church, therefore, had no dominion if lacking in grace, and likewise the state. Both might have ownership, but not legitimate authority, since all authority and dominion come from God and are subject to his law, word, and faithfulness thereto. This leads us to a fact which modern man is unwilling to face. If dominion, authority, and rule come from God by his ordination, and can only be truly exercised in terms of his law word and in his grace, then any departure from God's word and the doctrines thereof is dangerous to man and society. Accordingly, for centuries, Christians viewed, to use Kuyken's term, quote, heresy as civil disorder, end quote. At times, this civil disorder was met by peaceful and missionary evangelizing methods, at other times by brutal repression. That question is not our concern here. The fact which cannot be avoided is this, that anyone who uses Romans 13 in any sense is establishing civil government in God and God's authority. The necessary consequence of this is to require civil government to be faithful to the foundation of its authority. To separate delegated authority from the delegator, God, is impossible. Every delegated authority goes with conditions, and the conditions govern the tenure of authority. According to Deuteronomy 17:18-20, speaking of the king, quote, and it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. End quote. The prophets are clear that all kings and nations are bound by God the Lord. Isaiah gives us the roll call of judgment over the nations, and Hebrews 12:25-29 give us the declaration of the great like shaking in the gospel era. Revelation also gives us the judgment of the Lord upon the nations, and the great feast of vultures is the counterpart to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Paul in Romans 13 is not giving us a different doctrine. He does not separate the state from God and give to it neutral and undelegated absolute powers. In every age, God, the Lord, speaks with contempt about the arrogance of the nations and promises and delivers judgment. Isaiah tells us, quote, behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. And Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor the beasts thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing and vanity. Isaiah 40:15-17. Shall this God stand by or allow his people to stand by idly when the nations arrogate sovereignty or lordship to themselves? If it was an abomination to God for the kings or Molochs of old to make Baalim or lords of themselves, is it any the less so when the modern state does? The authority to rule comes from God alone. Our Lord declares, quote, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. What is true for man here is true for his institutions, for the family, church, and state. When the state severs itself from God and his law word, it severs itself from its authority. To restore that authority means that we place ourselves, our families, schools, callings, and civil governments under the every word of God.